False accusations and injustice can really be, they can be deadly. I read about a story this week. It was actually a TV documentary back in the 90s about a 19-year-old boy named Paco. He was from the Philippines, and he was accused of being guilty of a double murder. Two girls had been abducted from a mall in the Philippines, and he was arrested for that crime. Now, here's the funny thing, and the reason we know it was a false accusation. He was in school over 350 miles away in a classroom where 35 students and teachers testified that he was there and couldn't have possibly committed the murder. However, he was tried before a judge who, the documentary said, slept through a lot of the trial. And it turns out that the father of the girls was a worker for a drug kingpin who was known to buy off judges and police. And so he was arrested, accused of something that he couldn't possibly be guilty of. As I said, false accusations, injustice can be a deadly thing. That's what we find happening in Psalm chapter 7, are false allegations toward David. We don't know a whole lot about it. There's a guy named Cush that's making these assumptions toward David, these allegations toward David. And we don't know much about him either. In the superscription to the psalm, it says this: a Sigion of David, which he sang to the Lord concerning Cush, a Benjamite. Now that first word, the second word, I guess, after A, I'm sure I butchered the pronunciation of it. We don't really know what that means. It's probably a musical term. It probably has to do, I think we can assume this and be okay with this. But it assumes, and it certainly goes to the heart of this psalm, this is a poem written with great emotion, and it was to be sung as a solo to God. So understand, this Psalm 7 is a solo David sings to God. So here is this song, here's this poem. What can we know? What can we know about this Cush? Well, we can deduce some things. It says Cush was a Benjamite. What does that mean? It means he's from the same tribe as Saul. Saul, the predecessor to David as king of Israel. And we know that Saul, especially later, became really, really jealous of David, even tried to kill David on several occasions. Remember that song? There was another song. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Well, Saul didn't care for that. And he was jealous of David and tried to kill David, and he even called his people, the other Benjamites, part of the tribe of Benjamin, to come to his defense in all of this. And so there was this turmoil that went on, if you will. And even after Saul was killed by the Philistines, there was this battle. It took David about 8 years until he was fully the king of Israel, until everything was kind of settled. We know of a couple of events that took place. We referred to one several weeks ago as we looked at one of the earlier Psalms. Remember when Absalom rebelled against David? And when he's having to run and leave Jerusalem, remember there was this guy from the tribe of Benjamin, this guy named Shimei, who cursed David as he fled. This is what he said. And Shimei said and cursed, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And after that rebellion was put down, another man from the tribe of Benjamin, a guy named Sheba, rose up against David and led a revolt against David as well. And so it doesn't take much of a stretch for us to deduce that another guy rose up. His name was Cush, and he accused David with these false accusations. Now, let me mention a couple of things about false accusations first. To slander any person is a serious matter. That opening story, I talked about the guy named Paco. There's still debate over what was right or wrong after all these years, in that, I guess, 25, 30 years ago. There's still debate on the internet about what really happened and what really transpired. When false allegations, false accusations come, it causes all kinds of issues, but especially in a case like in David's case. Think about his position. He is the king. And if these accusations about David are true, it takes away his ability to really rule and reign in the kingdom. After all, he is responsible for the legislation of what goes on, for the administration of what goes on, for the upholding of justice in the kingdom. He's responsible for this, and if he can't be trusted by either friend or foe, then how could he possibly reign in the kingdom And you see that this kind of accusation would open the door for a moral rebellion, but also for a flat-out military rebellion as well. It's a serious, serious thing for someone like David to have an accusation like this leveled at him. But here's the second thing about these false accusations. It's just they're so difficult to deal with. How do you deal with the false accusation? If they come toward you or I, it's a little bit different. We're not the king of a nation, and so it's not going to affect a whole kingdom, but it's going to affect you, it's going to affect your family, it's going to affect your workplace, it's going to affect you at church. These false allegations, these false accusations are going to affect you right where you live. So what do we do when we're attacked falsely? Should we respond in kind? That's one option. We could respond in kind and just come right back at them. Should we do that? I don't think so. That's just lowering ourselves to the level of the person that's leveling this false accusation at us in the first place. But that's one option. What about this one? Do we just protest openly? There's this false accusation coming at you. Do you just protest openly and loudly so people know you're not? Well, if you do that, think about what happens. You're just keeping it out in the open. You're keeping it out in the public, and you're kind of fanning the flame of the false accusation. Somebody's going to say, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. Or like in the case of some, they might even quote Shakespeare, methinks he doth protest too much. And so what do? How do you respond to it? If you try to vindicate yourself that way loudly, people are going to start to think, maybe there really is something to this. So what do you do? What can you do when false accusations come toward you? I would say, by the way, I think in a sense, false accusations come toward all Christians today because of this public straw man that the secular world has set up toward what they think Christians are. And so there's this target of what people think that we are when I hope we're not the things that they think we are at all. But what are we to do? Well, the only thing we are to do is exactly what David did, and that's to take your problem to God. That's what we're to do. That's what he does. Now, before we get to Psalm 7, I want to read you a psalm. One of my favorite psalms is Psalm 37:5. But I want you to hear 37:5, and I want you to hear verse 6 after it. Listen to what it says. Commit everything you do to the Lord. Trust him, and he will help you. Now listen to verse 6. He will make your innocence radiate like the dawn, and the justice of your cause will shine like the noonday sun. You hear that? He will show the reality of what's real about your life, and he will show your innocence and your righteousness, if you will. Here's the deal. Here's what we can be sure of. If someone accuses you or me of something falsely, they can fool our friends. They can perhaps fool our coworkers. They can fool the public at large. They might even could fool our families. But they cannot fool God. And ultimately, if we are obedient to God and go to him and trust him, ultimately, verse 6 will become true. He will make your innocence radiate like the dawn, and the justice of your cause will shine like the noonday sun. Now, it may not happen next week or next month or even next year, but ultimately that will be a reality for you if you're falsely accused of something. So in our text, David says three things. I'm going to give you a real simple outline up front, and then we'll just walk through the outline. We're going to probably cover just half the chapter. But David, here's the outline. David says, save me, search me, stand up for me. So let's think about the save me. Listen to the first verses. He says, save me. He says, O Lord my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me, or they will tear me like a lion and rip me to pieces with no one to rescue me. Now, like in the other Psalms, David's not calling on a stranger here. He is calling on his personal God, the God he knows personally. And we talked about this before, that word Lord in all caps, Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God, the God who keeps his promises, the God that is his God, he says. David calls on the God he knows. He cries to Yahweh, based on this personal relationship. And he says, I take refuge in you. God, I take refuge in you. I trust you. I've never experienced this, but this is a picture of what it means to take refuge in God. I've never experienced this personally. Some of you perhaps have. I called one of our Oklahoma staff members because I figured he would have more experience with this. But if you've ever had a tornado come through your home when you're at home, you know what it means to take refuge. I call Randy Fair. Randy grew up in Oklahoma, and I said, Randy, have you ever had to run to shelter from a tornado coming toward your house? He said, no. He said, but I will tell you, growing up, my house had a basement, and we knew that's where we were to go. It was part of our family. And he said, in fact, anytime there was any storm at all, my mom kind of went and hung out in the basement. He said my dad would never go there unless the tornado would have been outside the door. He wouldn't have gone down for protection. By the way, that's a pretty good picture of how some people run to God, isn't it? Some of us are always ready to run to God because we know we should run to him for refuge. Some of us are over here thinking, I can handle this on my own. Well, we need to be running for refuge. But that's the picture of what this means here, to run to God for refuge. Run to him because not only does he give us protection, he is our protection. He is our refuge. And then he says this, he says, or they will tear me up like a lion and rip me to pieces with no one to rescue me. We've all seen pictures of lions tearing their prey apart. When I read this, I thought about the next service will have no clue what I'm about to say. You will. Remember was it Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom? Remember that? Yeah, I told you you'd know. It was in black and white, as my recall. But can't you remember seeing lions tear their prey apart? You can go to the internet now and see it live and in color. But that's what he's saying here. God, if you don't rescue me, there's no one else that will. I run to you to rescue me because there is no one else. If not you, then who? If not you, there's no one. I trust you. David took refuge in Yahweh, the God who keeps his promises. And there's blessing when we take refuge in God. If you go back and read where we've been already in this study, back at the end of Psalm chapter 2, the very last verse, verse 12 says this, blessed are all who take refuge in him. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. You take refuge in God and you're blessed. That's the path to blessing. And then in chapter 5 it says, but let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exult in you. When you run to God for rescue, for refuge, you will be blessed and you will find comfort in him. Here's the problem for us. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself and feeling guilty about this. But if our ultimate hope is not in God, when false accusations come, this anxiety in us will bubble up. And it will continue to bubble up, and it will cause us to respond in ways we should not respond. If God is your refuge, you will be poised in a way where you won't have to lash out at other people that falsely accuse you. If God is your refuge, I'm not saying you shouldn't defend your name when you're falsely accused. You should. But if God is your refuge first, then you can defend your name in the best way that you can without doing things that are godless toward other people. Do you hear the difference in those two things? It's not saying don't defend yourself. It's not saying don't defend your name. But first take refuge in God so you can do it in an appropriate way, in a self-controlled way. Now, I'm going to give you a way of confession. The reason I know this can be difficult is I blew it this week, not because I was accused falsely of something either. I was just watching a news channel. I know none of you are guilty of this. And this is the weirdest story. There's a lady in Chicago, sweet lady. And a guy had taken her house. He moved into her house as a squatter. Maybe you saw the story. I hope you handled this better than I did. He moved into her house as a squatter and she can't get her house back. He's got legal protection. It's her house. This guy has moved in. He's got a couple of dogs in there with him. She has no legal recourse. This guy is in her house. And she's so sweet explaining it. And the guy said, well, can't you get him out? And she said, well, if I do that, then I'm guilty of stuff, then I can be held accountable. And then she's saying this, and I'm just going to be honest here. I'm thinking to myself, I can get him out of that house. And I start to think of ways I can get him out of that house. I'm not going to confess what those ways were that I could get him out of that house. Here's what I'm saying. There's a fine line here. See, it's okay. If I want justice for that lady, she deserves justice. That's a good thing if I want justice for her in the right kind of way. But my justice for her and righteous indignation for her crossed over into, I want that guy to pay for what he's doing. You hear the difference in those two things? And that's what happens when we're falsely accused of something. If we don't make God our refuge first, we cross over and begin to make it about revenge instead of about justice. Justice is right. Justice is good. There's nothing wrong with justice. We should work for justice. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we have to go to God as our refuge first. So he says, save me. God save me, or they'll tear me apart and leave me in the dust. And then he says, search me. O Lord my God, if I have done this, and there is guilt on my hands, and then these next couple of verses kind of tell us what he's being accused of, if you kind of read between the lines and listen. If I have done evil to him who is at peace with me, or without cause have robbed my foe, then let my enemy pursue and overtake me. Let him trample my life to the ground and make me sleep in the dust. Selah. David says, O Lord my God, search me, but I'm innocent. I'm innocent here. Now, Cush's words were truly a false accusation. That they were. But understand that David was not saying that he is perfect and sinless. What David was saying was, he's not guilty of the things that Cush is accusing him of. That's what he's saying. I'm not guilty of these things. Sometimes when people say things about us, we can say they're false, but maybe they're not false at all. And sometimes we can rally people to our side even to make us feel better about our position when maybe we weren't all right in it. And they can make us feel better, and they can say, oh, poor you, and all this. But we need to make sure that we're really innocent of the thing we're being accused of. We need to search our hearts and make sure we're really. It's like when you watch an NFL game sometime, you'll see a lineman get called for some penalty, right? He'll do something like he'll grab a guy by the face mask and yank his head off or something like that, you know. Those guys are pretty vicious. And so he gets a flag. But what you didn't see was what the guy did first to him when the guy took a shot at his knee or something like that. And he was just responding to what the guy did. It wasn't a false accusation at all. The guy really, you get the message. So we need to check our hearts and make sure it really is a false accusation. We can fool other people and make them think we're in the right, but we can't fool God. God knows whether we're in the right or whether we're not in the right. And so David takes what Derek Kidner calls here the oath of innocence. He's so sure that he is not guilty of what this Cush is accusing him of that he says, I will accept the consequences of this if he's right. So in verses 3-5, there are these if-then statements. Yeah, there are 2 ifs, and some of the translations will have 3 ifs. But in 3 and 4, there are these ifs. If these things are true, God, then go ahead and let these consequences be laid out on me. So listen to it in the Message, and you'll get a really good picture of what the ifs are and what the then is. So in the Message, Eugene Peterson says it this way: God, if I've done what they say, betrayed my friends. So there's one of the accusations. He's betrayed friends. If I betrayed friends or ripped off my enemies, he's treated enemies in a way he shouldn't have treated them. That's what he's being accused of, which would be a big deal for a king to hold his kingdom if he's doing those 2 things. He says, if I've done that, if my hands are really that dirty, then let them get me. Walk all over me, leave me flat on my face in the dirt. In other words, he's so sure of himself, he says, God, if these things are true, if they're true, let them get me. Let them rip me apart like that lion and leave me in the dirt there, forgotten forever and ever. But David is safe in his innocence because he's examined his heart, and he knows he's pure before God in this instance. And he knows that any judge that is righteous and knows will rule in his favor and not in the favor of the one making the accusations. That's how sure David is. And so that leads to the next part of the outline. David says, stand up for me. And I'll explain it more. He says, stand up for me as the righteous judge that you are. He says, arise, O Lord, in your anger. Rise up against the rage of my enemies. Awake, my God, decree justice. Let the assembled peoples gather around you. Rule over them from on high. Let the Lord judge the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity, O Most High. O righteous God, who searches minds and hearts, bring to an end the violence of the wicked and make the righteous secure. So after establishing his innocence, David turns to Yahweh as the righteous judge. And he gives these three strong imperatives, but basically, and I've just kind of encapsulated them to say, he says, stand up and defend me, God, as the righteous judge. You're exalted over all. You rule before your people. You judge before your people. Judge in this case. And David sings, remember, he's singing this song, this psalm to God as a solo. And he says, decree justice. And then he makes a great statement. He says, judge me, O Lord. Before such a righteous judge, the innocent don't need to be afraid. Because this judge always gets it right. And so the psalmist says, in my righteousness and in my integrity, judge me. And so he doesn't worry because he knows this judge knows everything and he always gets it right. This kind of judge can always be trusted to do what is right, both with the innocent party and with the guilty party. And so it'll lead to its proper conclusion. But context is crucial to understanding this. David is convinced after searching his heart that he's not wronged either friend or enemy. He's convinced of that. But like I said a moment ago, he's not claiming to be sinless or morally pure. That's not what he's doing here. But here's the point I want you to see and not miss. Don't miss that in this instant, he is ultimately entrusting the matter to God. God, in these accusations about me, I entrust them to you. That's what he's doing here. He knows God's judgment is always right. He can pray in verse 9, bring to an end the violence of the wicked and make the righteous secure. Why? Because he's already acknowledged that God is righteous and he searches hearts and minds. When I was reading this week and studying it, something came to my mind. I know I'm guilty of this sometime in teaching, probably all of us. If you're a teacher here, you probably are too from time to time. Sometimes we assume too much. We assume we're all on the same page and that we understand. When I read this, the Lord just kind of stopped me with it. So I just want to make this point. Some of you will say, well, duh, that's obvious. Well, maybe it's not to everybody. Do you understand that God searches your heart and your mind? Everything about you, God knows. There are no secrets in your mind, in your heart, anything about your life, things you've never verbalized to a single person on this earth, God knows about you. God searches our hearts and minds and he knows us. He knows the depths of who we are and everything we think is hidden from the world. He knows it all. Hebrews 4:12 tells us the word of God exposes our innermost thoughts and desires. And then verse 13 says, nothing in all creation is hidden from God. Everything is naked and exposed before his eyes, and he's the one to whom we are accountable. Do you know that God knows everything about you? He searches your heart. You can't hide anything from him. He knows you. I was with Dr. Young one time, and we were with a couple of other men. I'm not going to tell you much about this story because there's some things you just keep quiet. But Dr. Young and I were with these men, and one of the guys was talking and telling us a story, and he said something, and he told us about a story, and in the story he talked about what crossed his mind, and he just said it bluntly to us, and it was pretty gross. And it was like it crossed his mind, but he didn't say it, so it was okay. And I remember Dr. Young and I just looked at each other like, is this guy nuts or what? I say that to say, understand that God knows everything about you, whether you verbalize it or not. He knows your heart. He knows our hearts. When we're right with him and before him, we don't have to fear him because he is a righteous judge. He always gets it right. He always gets it right. Now let me just, for the sake of time, let me do a couple of things. Let me tell you what happens in the rest of this chapter. Much of what happens in the rest of this chapter, we've already looked at in other Psalms that we've covered to this point. So in the rest of this Psalms, he says that God will protect him. He says, and once again, this idea of God as our shield comes up. This at least the third time, I think, maybe the fourth time, now that we're in Psalm 7, that the idea of God as our shield comes up. So he's our shield against our enemies. God is righteous, continues to come up in this chapter. That God expresses his wrath against evil every day. God judges evil. God judges sin. It's crystal clear in this passage. And God, he even says God's going to judge David's accusers if they do not repent. And then it's that idea again that God has arranged things so that the evil that people plan fall back on them. Remember we talked about Haman and how he ended up being hung on the gallows he had built for Mordecai in one of the earlier chapters. So that's all in this chapter, toward the end of the chapter. And then David closes this song to God that he writes and sings as a solo, and he says, I will give thanks to the Lord because of his righteousness, and will sing praise to the name of the Lord Most High. He praises God when he's walked through all this in spite of the false accusations toward him. When we're falsely accused, what do? I mentioned earlier, I think to an extent, all Christians are falsely accused today by the secular world. And then there's all kind of false accusations that happen to people on social media. Happens all the time. So when those things happen in our lives, and they happen in our lives, what do? Well, he makes it really clear. We cry out to God. We run to him as our refuge, and we say, God, save me. We say, God, save me, because if we don't, we're going to be tempted to lash out in a way, in an uncontrolled way that becomes a godless thing on our behalf. God, save me. God, search me. Search my heart. Make sure my heart is pure in this. Make sure this accusation against me is not true. God, search me. God, stand up for me. Oh, righteous judge. And so I guess just a couple of takeaways. Number one, when we're slandered, let God take care of the matter. I'm not saying don't defend your name where it's reasonable, but run to him and let God take care of the matter when you're slandered. That's number one. Number two, know that the Lord knows the motives of both the pure, the just, and the unjust. He knows the motives of the person that's being accused. He knows the motives of the accuser. God knows our hearts. Now, there's something in this passage that maybe some of you have had some pushback against. Actually, there's a couple of things. I'm just going to deal with one of them. But when you read this, it's from on this side of the cross. We're on this side of the cross now. There are some difficult things in here. And C.S. Lewis helps us with this. C.S. Lewis has a book called Reflections on the Psalms. And in the Psalms, he says there are two kinds of justice. He says there is this ultimate or heavenly justice, this ultimate or heavenly justice, and there's a temporary or limited earthly justice. I shouldn't say temporary, but a limited earthly justice. Our passage today deals with this earthly justice, this temporary justice. And he points out, I won't spend too much time on this, but he points out that in the mind of the Jewish writer like David, he would be dealing with this earthly justice. And not only that, he would not see himself as the defendant, he would see himself as the plaintiff in the matter. And that's why you hear David's heart in this. God, my heart is pure in this. He's looking at this. But for you and I, if you read these verses, if you just pull these verses out and read them, I can't pray this prayer that David prayed. Listen to what David prayed in verse 8. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity, O Most High. Now let me ask you a question. Can you honestly pray to God? You want to stand before God today and you want to pray, judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity? Do you want to pray that before a holy God? I don't. I lose. I lose that game. But I'm talking about the heavenly justice now, because I'm a sinner. And so we see a passage like this, and it gets hard because we know we're all sinners and there's none righteous, no, not one. And so we're looking at this earthly or heavenly justice, this permanent justice, this eternal justice. And we say, we can't pray a prayer like that. But the reality is, there's only one who can pray that prayer, and his name is Jesus. Only Jesus could pray, judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity, O Most High. Because Jesus was sinless and he was perfect. And here's the really good news today as we talk about heavenly justice. As we talk about heavenly justice, listen to verse 5. Remember, this was David's prayer? David says, if I'm guilty of these things, then let my enemy pursue and overtake me. Let him trample my life to the ground and make me sleep in the dust. The only one who was not guilty, who is righteous, allowed himself to be overtaken and trampled in the ground and put in the dust and hung on a cross for your sin and my sin, so we could be forgiven and have real life. And because he went to the cross on our behalf, now as we think about this heavenly justice, we can be seen as righteous and pure, not because we deserve it, not because we are, but because of the one who can pray, judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, allowed himself to be trampled for us. And so here's the takeaway from the passage. God calls us to live with justice in the here and the now. We need to live with justice. We need to treat people justly. We need to work for justice for people. When we're falsely accused, we need to run to him for refuge. Make sure our hearts are clean and pure. And call on him to be our righteous judge. Understanding all the while that our only hope before him is the reality that he is the righteous one. He's made a way for us to be forgiven and be righteous in his eyes. So for those of you that know Christ today, I say let's practice. Let's make sure we're practicing justice, this horizontal justice on earth, in a way that brings him glory. And if you don't know Christ, you need to come to him today, the one who loved you enough to be trampled on your behalf, to pay for your sins so you could be seen as righteous before a holy God. That's how much God hates sin. He allowed his son to be trampled for us. And God calls us to come to him, the only one who can make us just.